Hi everyone, today we're reading chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is called Eating Out. Annie kept smiling at the gorillas. Wow, she said. Wow, wow, wow. Didn't you know you were sleeping next to them? Jack asked. No, she said. When you didn't come back, Bubba led me here, but I couldn't see anything because it was too dark. Just then, Bubba left her mother's arms and bounded over to Annie. She climbed into Annie's lap and hugged her. Another small gorilla left his mother and ran over to Annie. He was about the size of a 2-year-old kid. Ho, ho, he said. He gave Annie a playful poke. Ho, ho yourself, said Annie. Is Ho, ho your name? She tickled Ho, ho. She tickled Bubba, too. The two small gorillas made laughing sounds and fell onto their backs. The two mother gorillas laughed, too. Ho, 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 they said. Jack felt a little jealous. He wanted the gorillas to like him as well, but he didn't really know how to join in the fun, so he just sighed and pulled out his notebook. He added to his gorilla behavior list. Gorillas like to tickle and laugh. Suddenly, he heard a low growl. He looked up. The silverback had moved closer to him, and he was glaring again. That big guy doesn't understand what you're doing, Annie called to Jack. He's never seen anyone take notes before. Jack quickly put his notebook away. The gorilla huffed. Then he turned to his family and gave a short bark. The gorillas began lining up behind the silverback. The baby traveled in his mother's arms. Ho-Ho traveled on his mother's back. Bubba and Annie held hands. They all followed the silverback out of the clearing. Come on, Annie yelled to Jack. Let's go with Big Guy and the gang. Jack shook his head. I don't think they want me to come along, he said. Bubba screeched at Jack. She held out her free hand to him. Bubba wants you, said Annie. Jack smiled shyly. He took Bubba's small, warm hand, and then he walked with Annie and the gorillas out of the clearing. On their ramble through the cloud forest, the gorillas found food everywhere. They munched flowers and ferns and leaves. They swallowed and burped. They munched twigs and branches and pieces of bark and bamboo. They swallowed and burped. As the gorillas ate breakfast, it started to rain again, but they didn't seem to mind. Annie didn't seem to mind either. She and Bubba played tag in the drizzly woods. They ran around the trees, laughing and screeching. Jack tried to follow them, but he gave up. He was tired and cold. Shivering, he stood under a mossy tree to keep dry. While he was alone, Jack sneaked his notebook out of his backpack and made a new list. Gorilla foods: flowers, ferns, leaves, twigs, bark, branches, bamboo. As he wrote, he heard a low growl. He looked up. Big Guy had spotted him. The silverback was standing close by. He was frowning at Jack, his lips tucked in a tight line. Sorry, said Jack. He quickly put away his notebook. Big Guy kept frowning. Jack quickly tried to act like a gorilla. He went down on all fours. He tore off the leaf of a plant and took a bite. It tasted bitter, like vinegar. Jack pretended to munch and swallow and burp. Big Guy huffed and then moved on. As soon as he was gone, Jack spat out the leaf. Yuck, he said, wiping his tongue. Jack felt a tap on his back, and he jumped. But it was just Ho-Ho. The small gorilla offered him a twig to eat. No thanks, said Jack. Ho-Ho kept holding out the twig. Okay, said Jack, politely taking it. I'll eat it later. He put the twig into his backpack. Ho-Ho's mom came over to Jack. She held some berries to his lips. No thanks, Jack said. The gorilla stared at him with a sad look. Oh, okay, said Jack. He opened his mouth and Ho-Ho's mom fed him the berries. Jack munched the berries. To his surprise, they tasted good. He swallowed, then burped, just like a gorilla. This time, he wasn't pretending. Bubba's mom then came over to Jack. She offered him some rainwater from a cupped plant. Jack was really thirsty. He sipped the water. It tasted fresh and cold. Bubba's mom took Jack's hand in her wide hand. She led him through the forest to Annie and Bubba. Bubba screeched happily when she saw Jack. She threw her furry arms around him. "Hi, we missed you," Annie said to Jack. "Are you having fun?" Jack smiled and nodded. Actually, he was having fun now. He didn't mind the rain so much anymore. He didn't feel so left out. Some of the gorillas really seemed to like him, he thought. They seemed to like him a lot. Chapter 8, A Special Language. The rain ended. Slowly, the feeding came to a stop. Big Guy led his family into a clearing. The tall grass sparkled with misty sunlight. The silverback lay down and tucked his arm under his head. The other gorillas gathered around him. Some beat the grass until they were flat. Ho-Ho's mom made a bed of weed stalks for Ho-Ho. Bubba's mom made a bed of leaves for Bubba. Then she made 2 extra beds, one for Jack and one for Annie. They lay down with all the gorillas to take their naps. Jack used his backpack for a pillow. Lying on his leafy bed, Jack watched the mother of the baby gorilla groom her small baby. The mother parted his hair and searched through it, picking at the skin now and then. The baby soon wiggled free and crawled around in the grass. His mother's gaze then rested on Annie. She moved over to Annie and gently grabbed one of her pigtails. She studied it carefully. "What are you doing?" Annie asked. "She's looking for bugs, I think," said Jack. "Oh, yuck," said Annie, standing up. Jack laughed. Just then, the baby's mother reached for him. "Oops, no thanks, no hugs on me," he said, and he sat up too. The mother gorilla lay back in the grass and closed her eyes. Her baby crawled over to Annie. "Hi, little guy," Annie said tenderly. She picked up the baby and stroked his head. The baby smiled at her and closed his eyes. While all the gorillas napped, Jack sneaked the book out of his backpack. He found the gorilla chapter, and he read softly to Annie. Gorillas are very smart. A captive gorilla named Coco has even learned sign language. Sign language is a special language used by people who cannot hear. Coco can say, "What?" Annie said loudly. "Sign language? A special language?" Her voice woke Bubba and Ho-Ho. They sat up and rubbed their eyes. "So," said Jack. "Morgan's secret rhyme," said Annie. "Don't you remember?" She repeated the rhyme. "To find a special kind of magic in worlds so far apart, speak a special language, talk with your hands and heart." "Oh, yeah," said Jack. "I even know a little sign language," said Annie. "In school, we learned how to sign, 'I love you.'" Annie held up a closed hand. Slowly, she lifted her thumb, index finger, and little finger. She showed the sign to Bubba and Ho-Ho. "I love you," she said slowly. The small gorillas looked curious. Jack made the sign too. "I love you," he said to Bubba and Ho-Ho. The 2 little gorillas stared at Annie and Jack. Then both of them held up their hands. They tried to make the same sign. Can you make that with your hands? Hi, Harley. "They love us too," said Annie. "Wow," said Jack. He glanced over at Big Guy. The silverback's eyes were open. He was watching them. Jack quickly closed the book. To his relief, the giant gorilla turned over. "Well," Annie said with a sigh, "I guess that does it." "We spoke a special language," said Jack. "We talked with our—" Before he could finish his sentence, Bubba pushed him. "Whoa," said Jack. Ho-Ho held his little arms above his head. He reared back and charged at Jack. With a flying tackle, he knocked Jack over. "What's going on?" said Jack. "They want to play with you," said Annie. Bubba jumped on Jack and put him in a headlock. Jack broke free from the 2 small gorillas. He jumped up and dashed into the forest. Bubba and Ho-Ho charged after him. Annie carried little guy and followed. She laughed as the small gorillas looked for Jack. Jack hid behind a tree. He pushed his glasses into place and he waited for Bubba. In a moment, she walked by. "Boo!" Jack shouted, jumping out. Bubba screeched and leaped straight up in the air. Jack cracked up laughing. Bubba didn't laugh, though. She bit her lip, and she hid her face behind her hands. "Oh, Bubba," said Annie. "Don't be scared." She gently put the baby on the ground. She reached out to comfort Bubba. Bubba wrapped her arms around Annie's neck. She buried her furry head in Annie's shoulder. Jack was just playing, said Annie. Bubba raised her head. She looked at Jack over Annie's shoulder. Friends? He asked softly. Bubba stuck her tongue out at him. Jack laughed. Bubba showed her teeth in a big smile. Friends? Said Jack. Just then, Ho-Ho started screeching. Jack and Annie looked around. Ho-Ho was pointing into the bushes. Where's little guy? Said Annie. She and Jack dashed around the shrubs. The baby had crawled to a tree. He was looking up at a branch. A huge, sleek cat with black fur was slithering on the branch. His pale green eyes stared down at the baby gorilla. He looked hungry. A black leopard, breathed Jack. The leopard leaped lightly down from his perch. He faced little guy. The baby looked scared. No, cried Annie. She ran over to the baby gorilla and scooped him up in her arms. The leopard let out a snarl. He lowered his head and started slowly toward Annie and the baby. Jack panicked. He didn't know what to do at first. Then he remembered Big Guy's act. Jack took a deep breath. When he let it out, he made a loud hooting sound. He tore out from the brush, hooting like a silverback. He ran between Annie and the leopard. Jack grabbed a tree limb and shook it. He ripped leaves from branches. He cupped his hands. He beat his chest. Rah! He roared. Then Jack leaned over and charged back and forth past the leopard. Finally, he threw himself on his belly and he began bashing the ground with his palms. He bashed and bashed and bashed. Jack, Annie called. Jack! Jack looked up. He's gone, Annie said in a quiet voice. The leopard's gone. He left a while ago. Oh, said Jack. He sat up. He pushed his glasses into place and looked around, and then he smiled. Tomorrow we'll finish our book. Tomorrow we'll come back and read chapters 9 and 10. See you then.